and what are we modeling, right? That's kind of a basic question. What are some examples of computable law that are being used today? What are some of the capabilities and limits of computable law? And what are some of the social limitations? So one of the distinctions I'm going to make in this talk is the distinction between technological limits, what our today's technology can and can't do, where we might go, and social limits, which are limits, even if it were technically possible, where might we not want to have computable law for various social reasons, in terms of promoting the values of law that we hold dear, values such as fairness, equity, performative reasons. So those are really two distinct topics, which I'll try tease out. Are there reasons to be optimistic about computable law? And what are some reasons maybe to be pessimistic or cautious about computable law? So let's talk a little bit about that. And I think a really good way to understand how computers interact with law is by first understanding how people interact with law. So my understanding is that this audience is not necessarily legally trained out there. So I'll just give a little bit of background. And for those of you who are legally trained, I apologize for the redundancy. But this is just a brief overview of the law, which will help us understand the way in which computers might interact with the law. So I think at the first instance, it's helpful to think of different categories of actors in the legal system. And we can group this, very simplistically in three major groups. There's the ordinary people out there in the world, people like you and me, who are out there trying to comply with the law or not break the law at a minimum. And I'd throw in with that a kind of similar category, which are businesses or corporations, but I'm not going to talk about them for the moment. And we'll just concentrate on ordinary people. So we're kind of walking through the world, not really sure what the law is, trying to comply with it more or less. Then we have attorneys, on the other hand, who are, of course, professionals who are specialists in the law, and they help people comply with the law. And then we have government officials. So let me say a little bit about the three different groups, because it turns out they interact with the law in slightly different ways that will be relevant to our understanding of computable law. So let's talk about how ordinary people like you and me interact with the law. So most of us try and go through life, I believe, trying not to break the law and also comply with the law more or less. And from our perspective as ordinary individuals, not really familiar with the details of the law, we just kind of understand the gist of the laws out there, right? We know that you see a speed limit sign and it says, don't drive more than 65 miles per hour. And there's probably some law behind that. And that, informally, you can probably drive 70 and nobody's going to complain. But if you go 100, you'll get a ticket. But it's probably the case that very few of you, perhaps none of you, have actually read the California speeding statute, the actual legal rule that underlies that law. So beneath that, there's an actual rule passed by the California legislature, which most of us don't know about, myself included, right? So this is sort of our informal understanding of the law. We also kind of have an informal understanding of the criminal law. We know more or less that we shouldn't steal, right? Shouldn't hurt people. And we know that's a violation of the criminal law, but probably it's the case that most of us have not actually gone in and read the formal laws. We just sort of informally know that. And most of the time that's good. We don't really need to know the context of the law or the 300 or so laws that criminalize theft alone, for example, let alone every other type of crime. However, sometimes the details become tricky and the details do matter. And then sometimes in that case, we either try and figure out the law ourselves, or more commonly, we'll go to a professional like an attorney who knows the details of the law. If we're paying our taxes, we might go to a tax attorney or an accountant, or not, as we'll talk about, we might use software. But or maybe if we're buying a house, there might be, or a major transaction, or filling out a will, the details of the law actually matter for our purposes. So we'll want to use somebody's expertise to really understand the law. And who is the expert on the law? Well, that's the attorney, right? The whole job of the attorney is to be trained in a few questions, how to find the law. And what you do as an attorney is you listen to your client's situation, whatever it might be, and you hear whatever is going on, and you work backwards from their story or their situation to the law and figure out what are the relevant laws that govern the situation. But that's not all you're doing, of course. What you're doing is applying those laws to your client's situation and then providing them advice, right? You're saying to them, hey, here's your potential liability under the law, and also here's advice about what I think you should do. So the job of the lawyer is to connect the dots, and sometimes the lawyer's advice is very confident and clear. This is definitely what you should do. But sometimes the lawyer will hedge his or her bets and say, well, it's really not clear. Here's what I recommend you do, but you should know that, there's an equally good argument on the other side. So it's 50-50. But in general, lawyers serve the link between the laws and the ordinary people in serious situations when the legal details matter, right? Which is kind of a minority amount of circumstances. Most of us are not going through life consulting lawyers every time we get in a car, of course, right? And providing advice on outcomes. So you won't need your lawyer's advice to figure out whether, driving 100 miles per hour in a 65 mile per hour zone is okay or not. And then finally, so we've got the people complying with the law, the people who are professionals in finding and interpreting and providing advice, and then government officials, and they really have a different standing. So by government official, I mean this term broadly. It's anybody in the government who is empowered to interpret the law, imply it, and enforce it. So this is anywhere from your state and federal legislators, your senator or your state representative, the government officials who run the different agencies at the state, city, or federal level, whether it's the Department of Labor or the Patent Office or your city, water management. It's the courts, the judges, the state and federal judges, and then it's the local police and other law enforcement authorities who are enforcing the law. And what distinguishes the government officials from these other groups in the law is that they're empowered to interpret and enforce the law. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it's government officials' interpretation of law that matters. All right. So it is the case, of course, that if a government official says you violated the law, you might be able to appeal that decision to another government official, like a judge or a higher judge, and get a different answer. But at the end of the day, it's some government official who's telling you this is the final answer, whether it's an appellate judge. So that's different in that they have sort of official authority to interpret the law and apply it and enforce it. So the reason I bring that up is that where you're situated in that group, either as an ordinary person, an attorney, or an official, is going to frame how you interact with the law. Similarly, it's going to frame, when we talk about computable law, how each of those different groups that use computer systems to interact with the law, how it's going to be very different, their interactions with the law. Okay, so just quickly, again, another basic question that you might ask yourself was, what are the law? We just talked about who operates with the law. Another question is, what is the law? And we can think about law as divided roughly into two major groups: formal sources of law and informal law. So what's the difference? So formal sources of law are actually usually written documents, whether electronic, promulgated by some authority or under the imprimatur or approvement of some authority. So most obviously, the things that look most like laws are statutes, which are passed by state or federal legislatures. These are what most people informally refer to as the law, what's behind your speed limit. But we also have administrative regulations. So there's a giant administrative state, either at your state level or the federal level, all these little agencies or big agencies that do all these things. They monitor the environment and labor standards and run the patent office. They all promulgate rules and regulations which have the effect of law, although we don't really see them if you're non-lawyer. There's also, in the US system has a really interesting feature as it shares with England. It's called the common law system, where court decisions by judges' opinions actually make law too. So the decisions of a court is binding on a future situation that's the same in that jurisdiction, in that state or locality. That's known as precedent. So the law is kind of buried in these lengthy opinions of judges. We also have constitutions, state and federal, which are high-level laws. And then what's interesting, people can make laws, right? So you can make your own laws through contracting. So we often call this private lawmaking, where you are a mini lawmaker making laws that apply only to yourself and those who you're signing the contract with. So you are voluntarily binding yourself when you say purchase a car to a set of legal obligations. No one's typically making you do this, right? You're voluntarily binding yourself for various reasons. So these contracts and other documents like wills that are created by people are also sources of law. So these are kind of the formal sources of law. And I bring these up because in modeling the law, which we'll talk about what that means, we're going to think about which of these do we have to represent in a computer form. All of them, none of them, some of them, right? So that's just the formal sources of law, meaning, again, these are things you can point at, bring up in a document and say, this is an explicit source of law. There's also widely recognized informal sources of law, right? So informal sources of law are things that are real and impact legal outcomes in the way people operate, but they're not as explicitly written. So sometimes this is called law on the ground, the way things actually operate. So good examples of these involve discretion by prosecutors, right? So prosecutors can choose to charge somebody with a crime, but they also typically have the discretion kind of let some crimes go in the interest of justice, even though it's a technical violation. And you see this all the time. There might be some old law on the books that, from the 1850s that nobody bothered to remove. And, you can't paint your house red. That's illegal. But the prosecutor might say, look, that's a violation, but we're not going to charge anybody with this. Or you've seen this in a lot of the states that have legalized marijuana. It's still a crime at the federal level, but the prosecutors say, all right, the states have said it's legal, so we're just not going to prosecute people. These are common practice. Another example of this is nobody ever reads terms of service with software, right? And that's widely understood. So imagine if companies enforced, every time you download software, it's a 50-page term of service, which nobody reads. Imagine they enforced all 300 terms of service against every customer every time, right? They'd lose all their customers. So it's widely understood that companies tend to only do this in the most egregious violators and kind of let everybody go. And there's also shared understandings and meanings of words like reasonable. Reasonable appears a lot in the law, but nobody defines it really. But we all kind of have an informal understanding of what reasonable means. Okay, so that's formal, informal sources of law. So let's talk about a computable model of law. So where are we? Well, we have different sources of formal law: statutes, administrative regulation, contracts, court decisions; informal law, shared practices and understandings, different people in society who interact with these: ordinary citizens like you and me, government officials like the police or the judges, and attorneys who are out there acting in their professional complicated. And there are hundreds and thousands, if not millions of laws, billions of contracts. It's really hard to figure out the law and comply with it. Wouldn't it be nice if computers could help us with this? Wouldn't that be great? Because computers help us in all these other areas, in medicine and the internet and all that. Why shouldn't computers be able to help us navigate this immense complexity? So now we get to the point of computable law, where it fits in. Are there ways that we can use modern computing technology, artificial intelligence, the prevalence of big data, the interconnectedness of computing to help us determine applicable laws that govern our circumstances, understand the laws, and use computers to help guide us to good, helpful, useful legal outcomes. So this is the idea of computable law, all right? Can we model some aspect of the law? When I mean model, of course, I mean a computer model, which for, in the basic understanding is you're kind of representing on the computer a model of some aspect of the world out there, albeit in simplified form that the computer can process. But it's not so simplified that it oversimplifies it. It's simplified just enough that the computer can still give you good, useful, real world results. So can we do that for law and for legal obligations? Can the computer either automatically or semi-automatically make sense of the law itself, provide us guidance, automated compliance or analysis? And can it help provide differential advice, to meet the ordinary people in the world who are just trying to make their way, the attorneys who are trying to make detailed, accurate decisions, and government officials whose decisions can deprive you of life, liberty, or property, really serious decisions, while at the same time promoting the values of the legal system that we hold dear. Things such as transparency, justice, explanation for outcomes, equality, things that are really important, and a way that preserve the way humans think about the law and the role of the law and the role of the law in society for mediating disputes and keeping order and enabling human flourishing, right? So it's kind of a tricky thing. There's a technical dimension, there's a legal dimension, and there's a social dimension. But at a very high level, all computable law projects involve, some version of the following. Find out the law. What are we talking about here? What do we want to use the computer to help us with? Is it statutes? Is it contracts? What aspect of the contracts? Is it the process? Is it the formal law? Is it the informal law? Right? So we have to figure out what we're trying to model. How do we represent it in the computer system? How are we doing that? What's the actual technique that we're doing that? And then how do we know that our representation is good? Actually it's accurate, is useful? Will it be handcrafted programmer statements that we think models the law? Will it be data about the law that we drop implicitly by scanning, large troves of data and gathering patterns? How will we analyze it? And then how do we know that the results will be useful, accurate, and fair and meet the values of society? And then are there trade-offs for making it computational? All right, so let me provide some actual examples of computable law because they're out there and it's being used right now. So let me just give you one common example just because it's familiar to many people, and that is software such as TurboTax. So tax software. So if you think about what's going on there, right? We have a set of laws, federal laws out there in the world, the Federal Income Tax Code. We as citizens of the United States or taxpayers have to comply with them or there are penalties, and it's pretty darn complex if you ever look at this. All right, so we have two options. We can either read all the laws or engage some professional to help us read the laws, or we can these days use something like TurboTax. And if you think what's going on at TurboTax, somewhere deep inside this software is something that we believe to be an accurate representation of some aspect of the laws regarding personal income tax code. But it's not just the laws itself, it's not just the text, it's the logic of the laws, the meaning of the laws are represented in some way that the computer can process and help us come to useful, accurate results about our tax liability under the law. So however the makers of TurboTax have done it, maybe they've done it using explicit programming statements or data, however it matters, we can think of there being a model, a computer model, a simplification of the law, but it's not so simplified that it's not useful. And in fact, we've preserved the essential features of the model, the logic and meaning of the law, and formulated it in such a way that the computer can process it and give us useful results, so useful that the IRS accepts these results, the government officials. Okay, so, just to give you an example, this is kind of, a simple example, but the personal income tax code says if you make more than $91,000, your tax rate for every additional dollar will be 28%. So I could, just use my reading and my thinking analysis to apply that rule, but that's a rule formulated in such a way that a computer can also be told how to apply that logic. So we can implement that logic through, a series of if-then rules that are rather simple. Or, there's more advanced logic that can happen. There are real benefits to this because once you represent something in computer processable form, the computer can engage it in chains of reasoning to produce non-obvious results that are actually really difficult or time-consuming for people. So just to give you a simple example, if business expenses under the tax laws, expenses for business are treated differently than personal expenses. So you could imagine, and this is what happens, grabbing expenses electronically from a business personal card, credit card, having that computer recognize that that's a business expense, having a set of rules that represent the computer tax code that apply only to business expense, and going through a chain of deductions that apply all the rules to that, saving everybody lots of time and money. And this is actually what you see. Okay, another example of computable law that's been out there very successful is what's known as computable contracts. We started seeing this in the financial industry about 20 years ago, where when you wanted to purchase a security, it used to be on paper, written in English, legalese, intended for other humans to read. And slowly over the last 20 years, most financial transactions involving securities like stocks and bonds and options have translated into data-oriented form, basically computer instructions written for other computers to understand and execute. And of course, we can translate that back for humans to understand through graphical user interfaces, but ultimately it's for computers to talk to each other, right? And again, remember, a contract is in a legal obligation. These legal obligations are being represented in a way that the computer can understand and process. We're starting to see this. We've seen this on the internet. Of course, everyone knows about cryptocurrency and how it's happening. These sort of computable contracts are happening in that space. So let me talk a little bit about some of the different approaches to computable law, and they roughly mirror the main approaches in artificial intelligence itself. So this is a bit of an oversimplification. I apologize for the computer scientists out there, but roughly, I think we can roughly divide artificial intelligence into two major approaches, the kind of knowledge representation and symbolic approach, right? And this approach involves sort of a top-down modeling of whatever we're modeling in the world through logic or computer instructions. So again, TurboTax is a good example of that. We have these laws out there in the world that represent the personal income tax. And then we're creating a computer model in TurboTax, but we're doing it very explicitly through manually programmed statements that mirror the logic. So this is kind of an older approach to AI that involves more of top-down explicit modeling of the world, much more manual. And of course, there's sort of the almost the converse approach, which has been responsible for much of the success of AI of the last 20 or 30 years, which is machine learning. And machine learning takes more of a bottom-up approach. So many of you are familiar with this, but in my telling of machine learning, I describe it as programming by looking through patterns in data. And that's what machine learning algorithms do. They detect patterns in data and get their operating rules through these detected patterns. And that's been extremely successful. So computable models of the law involve both approaches and also hybrids of the two. And I don't want to underestimate the impact of knowledge representation, or KR, the kind of older version, because I think that's been very impactful in law and still has a lot of impact. But machine learning has also been very impactful as of late. So let me just tell you one good example of a machine learning system that's widely used in law. So when in criminal law, you have a defendant who's being accused of committing a crime, he or she goes before the judge, and at some later date, the judge will have a trial. In between that time, the judge has to decide whether to allow the defendant to post bail and therefore be released, or instead be detained until trial. So the most important decision factor that the judge will use in making that decision is the risk of reoffending of that defendant. What is the likelihood that if I release this defendant before trial, he or she will commit another crime? Right? So it used to be historically judges would do this based upon experience and intuition. More recently, they've used machine learning systems, and these machine learning systems purport to detect predictors of likelihood of reoffending based upon past data involving police arrest records and prior defendants, based upon various activities that seem to be more or less likely to predict. And a lot of court systems are now using this to predict likelihood of reoffending and affect bail decisions. Okay, so that's and I'll have more to say about that later, but that's an example of machine learning being applied as a computer model, because there we have some data involving the law. A machine learning algorithm has scanned that data, detected patterns that are indicative of likelihood of reoffending or not. And then a legal official, a judge, uses that data to guide some outcome, either releasing the defendant or not. Okay, so I think they're both useful approaches to law. I think the main difference is the explicitness or implicitness degree to which you're representing the law. So in the knowledge representation version of the law, like the TurboTax, it's very explicit. The law has been sort of handcrafted, or the logic of the law has been manually represented by programmers. And you can, in TurboTax, I don't know how it works under the hood, but it's probably the case that you can point to some part of the personal income tax law that has some rule, and then point to some section of the computer code that says this computer code implements the logic of that rule, so it's very explicit. By contrast, in machine learning, by its very nature, it's more implicit. So the information about the risk of reoffending is in the data, but it has to be drawn out. So it's an implicit model that's embedded in the data, and the algorithm figures out those predictors, but it's not as explicit. You can't point to it as easily and say, that's the law there, the way you can in the other. But what they do have in common is that they purport to serve as a computer-processable model of some aspect of the law, right? In either case, the computer is saying, oh, I now have something about the law that I believe is modeling something that I can do something with and produce some automated results, right? So one of the reasons I mentioned that, because I want to distinguish it from other uses of computers in the law, like retrieving the text of statutes. So we, probably most of us know, you can type into Google the name of any law or statute, even your speed limit law for your state. It'll bring it up in text form, but that text form doesn't really have any logic or meaning for the most part, putting aside natural language processing, which we will do for the moment, that the computer can do anything with, right? Why? Because that text is intended for human consumption. It's for humans to read the law. It's not been formulated in a way that's useful for computers. So just want to make that distinction. Okay, so let me, in my last couple minutes here, about 10 more minutes, I want to talk about some limitations to computable law, technical and social limitations. So I think the technical limitations of computable law, and these refer to limitations in the state of the art, primarily of artificial intelligence. So the limitations of computable law are really the limitations of artificial intelligence itself. So what are some of the limitations related to law? Well, law requires a whole web of understanding in order to make sense. So even a speed limit law, which is written in text, depends on a whole social context in order to make sense. You need to know what's a vehicle, what's driving, what is safety, how do weather conditions involve, the difference between cars and bikes and trucks and ambulances, driving while intoxicated. So there's a whole web of social and societal knowledge that's really hard to represent computationally today. It's particularly hard with today's formal knowledge representation systems. This is one of the known weaknesses in sort of symbolic logic or other formal ways, is that they fail. It's really hard to represent kind of some nuances or social implications in society. And there've been a bunch of really complex efforts like the Psych project, which some of you might know about, but they just haven't been able to crack that nut. So that same problem applies to machine learning as well. Often the complexities of society kind of get diminished when you draw things out in data. That's a problem because the complexities often matter in law in ways they might not matter. Another technological limitation, again, has to do with the state of AI. So people often say, and I agree with this, that you might call today's AI kind of weak AI, as opposed to strong AI, which is, perhaps the AI of the future, kind of the speculative AI of the future, otherwise known as artificial general intelligence, but it's basically, computers who would operate at a level that meets or exceeds humans on any arbitrary intellectual task, whether it's philosophy or, discussion or analytical reasoning. So we're not there yet for sure, and maybe we'll get there. Maybe we won't. People don't really know, but at a minimum, we're not there right now. And it matters because law does actually involve a lot of abstractions, things like reasonable and fairness, and things that today's AI just is not very good at handling. Today's AI tends to operate very well under particular conditions that are limited and have patterns, but in many instances, less so under abstractions. I call this producing today's AI, particularly machine learning, I say can produce intelligent results without intelligence, meaning often the data is able to detect proxies or stand-ins for useful results without going through the same higher order cognitive processes that a similarly situated human might use, like abstract reasoning. And then finally, computers today AI systems don't do well with a lot of discretionary tasks involving concepts like reasonable, because similarly for abstraction reasons. There's another set of limitations I want to raise, though. These are social limitations. And that is distinct from technical limitations, which is, imagine we could represent the law computationally and use computers to make legal decisions in lots of different areas that maybe we can't today. Do we actually want to? And what are the trade-off from doing that? And we still might not want to implement such a system in lots of areas of law for various social reasons. And this is often described as the social performative function of law. So there's kind of a simple view of law, that law is about finding right answers, whether somebody did or did not do X and violate the law. It's kind of this truth-telling role. But, and it is sometimes like that, did Bob steal X or not? But there's a more complex, nuanced version of laws serving other kind of social performative roles in society in terms of societal integrity. So sometimes somebody shows up to court not to have a right answer, but have the social function of having their day in court, regardless of what the outcome is. Or sometimes people want to be judged by a community of peers in a jury quite apart from what the outcome is. The process of being judged by a community is as important as the substance of the decision itself. So in such an area where there's this performative social importance of law, a computable model might not be appropriate. And another related situation is a lot of law is not about finding right answers. It's about making value and policy decisions for which there is no right answer. And the job of the government and the legal system is to peacefully resolve disputes among members of society that just have different views. So just to give you a simple example, imagine that the government wants to put, or a nonprofit wants to put a homeless shelter in your suburban neighborhood, right? So some of the residents might support that. Some of the residents might oppose that, but there's not an objectively right answer to that. There are trade-offs in different views and different social values. So a computer system would not be appropriate in the sense that it's telling us the right answer, because there is no right answer, right? This is a dispute between members of society, and the role of the legal system is to help mitigate this dispute and mitigate trade-offs in a peaceable manner. So again, this is kind of a social limitation where the law isn't performing this accuracy role. And then finally, I'm running out of time here, so maybe I'll answer this in the Q&A, but there's the well-known problem of biases in computer systems, right? So this has been not well studied by now, but the gist of it is, for example, if you have a machine learning model that learns patterns from data, if that data is itself biased in some way, maybe against various groups in society, because of historical police practices that were inequitable, those patterns or unfair patterns will be learned by the system itself in ways that are often hard to detect. So that's another problem that's not unique, I think, to computable law, because humans, of course, have biases too, but it's something we want to be on the lookout for. All right, so I will pause there, as I think I've bumped up into our time limit, and I'd love to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Harry, for a thought-provoking talk. Please, if you're in the audience, please put your questions in the Q&A. I will start with a provocative question that's there. They're asking, what is your view on AI ML predictive models that infer an individual's behavior, as the one you described, based on the group they belong to? Can you
Yeah, so that is a great question. So I think if the subtext of the question, I think that should be the subtext of the question, is improper classifications that either society views as problematic or classifications that are illegal. And just as an example, it is illegal to use race in making negative hiring decisions, like a decision not to hire somebody, right? That's illegal under the law, and it's also socially inappropriate under most people's agreement, quite apart from. So I think as it pertains to that, it's very problematic, actually. And one of the major problems with a lot of machine learning systems is that they have the aura or the kind of veneer of objectivity, right? So it's very clear to a lot of people when you see a human making a decision, right? That human, we know they're infused with, potentially infused with bias. But when you see a decision coming out of a computer, it's really easy to think, wow, that computer is making a totally neutral, objective decision based upon data. But that's not always the case, right? Sometimes things such as zip codes or income can be proxies for other things that we might be concerned about, such as race or ethnicity or gender. So it's a real concern.
And as a follow-up to that, I wanted to follow up with another question. Is so you described these predictive models. Can you give us a little more details of where are these used, what states, and then what is the process to actually make this legal? I mean, what is the benchmarking, or how do you go? Like at the for medical devices, we go through the Food and Drug Administration. There's a whole. So what are the studies you actually have to do that allows you to actually implement such a predictive model and show that it actually works better than what we have?
Oh, this is a great question. So it's used primarily at the state trial level, and in a bunch of states, like Florida is notable for using it, not so much at the federal level. And to your second question, what is the validity of it? This is a real problem. And the problem comes from a couple of levels. Mostly these systems are created by private companies, which itself is not a problem, except that they use trade secret law, which is a special area of law that allows you to keep things secret to shield both the data that the model was made upon, and also the model itself and its validity. So this is a real problem because there's a real lack of transparency, and mainly this has been aided by the fact that courts and local governments are not sophisticated agencies when it comes to machine learning, for the most part. I mean, it's a generalization. I'm sure they're so they either don't have the resources or the knowledge to ask the right questions that you are asking right now. They've sort of sold these systems as kind of turnkey, accurate systems, and they just more or less, from my understanding, just kind of take it off the shelf at word that these are valid, accurate systems. But there have been some independent studies by journalists that have really questioned whether there's any validity using this. So it's a real problem, actually.
Okay, next question. Do you foresee any practical use of machine learning either by licensed attorneys or non-attorneys in, say, compliance or GRC type of roles in evaluating legal risk and then company decisions?
I do, and already it's kind of happening. But the way I think about machine learning and law is a little bit like the way I think about translation. So some of the neural network automated translation systems that you see from Google out there are like pretty good about giving you a very rough cut on a translation, but you wouldn't want to use that to create a document that anything super important depended on. And it's kind of a similar thing that's going on in law right now. So kind of the machine learning, natural language processing can go through and look for kind of red flags that bring things to the attention of lawyers, but you don't want to rely on the system for the most part to be making that decision. But what's really good is culling through vast amounts of data and bringing things to the attention of lawyers who can then make more informed decisions. So we're starting to see that now in automated diligence and compliance. So it's pretty interesting.
Okay, here's another question. There we go. How does one begin to form the objective functions that would be necessary to compute whether an algorithm is furthering the goals of society? It's a tough question. This
Yes.
question seems too philosophical and semantic to be put into machine language.
Yes, this is a great question that I'm working with this right now, actually with another professor with kind of formulating these problems. So one of the big issues with law and computable law is what goes inside the model and what goes outside. And that, that's kind of a problem with computing more generally. And this is one of the biggest issues with, I think, it's AI in general. So I'm doing some work with an idea that we call AI loyalty, with making sure that AI systems such that you see, from Google or Amazon that might be automatically recommending something are somehow not or furthering your interests and not giving you the appearance that they're furthering your interests when in fact working against your interests. But this is sort of gets to your point, is how do you formulate any sort of objective function? Do you do it explicitly? I mean, very often in the technological space, we do things implicitly through design choices that we make. So nobody's saying we're doing X or Y, it's we're choosing to pick this data set or to use this system in this way, and it kind of has this implicit value decision effect. And I think that's sort of what we're doing now, because we don't have a robust enough language, and there's also not agreement on what society's goals are too. So that's a great question.
Okay, so the fascinating questions keep coming. So we'll see how many we can answer. So um, this might be two questions in one. I think you will see what your interpretation is. You spoke of the problem of biased data collection. How does machine learning deal with the specification error? And what happens when machine learning results violate the implicit premises of written law?
I think I need a little bit more clarity on what is meant by that.
By the first, let's go for the second one. What happens when the machine learning results violate the implicit premises of written law? Is that something that actually could happen?
Yeah, it definitely could happen. So just to, give a trivial example, right? We should never, imprison an innocent person, right? Or we should minimize that. And what if the outcome of the machine learning recommends that, somebody is likely to commit a crime when, maybe the chance is actually zero or close to zero, and it just got it wrong. So so it definitely is possible. And I think it gets back to Miguel, to your point, like what is our validation? So there's a lot of research in this area. They call this research, which you might have seen, fairness, accountability, and transparency research. Is like a body of research that tries to think about, how do you incorporate values in the different trade-offs? How do you measure, particularly in social technical systems, which are systems used in society broadly, like these systems are? How do we come to good measures of these systems? So I'll say one of the common responses to this, which I think is a fair response, which is the human systems do these same mistakes all the time, right? When humans are making these decisions, we unfairly imprison people and do all these things. And now that it's been represented explicitly in a computer system, it just might make it easier to detect these errors. And that's actually kind of a good thing. But I think it also comes down to, how do we explicitly formulate these trade-offs? Does that make sense?
Makes sense. Here's a short one. I think this one is, how would you reduce the implicit bias in data and data-assisted decisions?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I just want to be clear too, because I believe it's a largely computer background. There's sort of different meanings of bias. There's kind of the technical meaning, which, Bayes' variance trade-off, like how generalizable is a model. That's not what I mean. We mean sort of the social meaning of bias, which is kind of unfair impact to various groups, disproportionate impact. That's what we mean. And a great example of it comes from, these sort of algorithms that purport to detect biases. That purport to predict the likelihood of reoffending. So it's well known that police practices themselves, police patrolling practices, are biased in the following sense. They will often patrol certain neighborhoods disproportionate amount, right? So if you have police on the ground in certain neighborhoods in more numbers, they're just statistically going to arrest more people. So you can imagine there were two neighborhoods where crimes were being committed at an equal rate, but police were just in one neighborhood more than another. The people in the other neighborhood would be arrested at a lower rate. And so those police practices, the patrolling practices, and also the recording practices, those biases can show up in the data, even when everybody feels like they're operating on neutral grounds. And those, like say one of the neighborhoods is a neighborhood primarily of people of color, and the other one is less primarily, those could be proxies for situations involving people of color and have harmful outcomes to people of color. So how do you deal with that? Well, one way is really just to be aware of the data, the differences that data collection practices have, data implementation practices, and kind of having benchmarks to see to the degree to which the data may or may not be biased. So there are techniques for dealing with this, but by and large, the bigger problem is that people are often unaware of these biases because they're very subtle and hard to detect, and they're embedded especially when they're embedded in a mathematical algorithm. They're super hard to detect.
Thanks. Here's a one. Given that you sort of described this idea of actually we need to keep tabs and seeing what's being done by the algorithms and so on. Here's a question that talks about that. To what extent will legal AIs be black boxes, especially the sub-symbolic AI stuff? Are we moving in a direction of more or less transparency in how AI works in legal applications and more generally?
Yeah, so kind of the view along a lot of people is if we have two different AI approaches, one is which they call more interpretable, where you can kind of look at it and figure out what's going on by looking at the data and the computer model itself, and one which is less interpretable, because even if it's producing good results, you can't easily tell what's going on, to prefer the more interpretable models. That's kind of a emerging preference out there. So that's one answer to that. And then, so I think we're potentially moving to both more and less transparency, right? So let's give the optimistic view. Again, humans have been making these legal decisions for years, and judges are certainly biased and have been biased, but we don't have the ability to peer inside their brains, right? So at a minimum, we have some degree to peer inside the brains of computer systems in the ways that we don't. And I think that's important because it's actually surfacing biases that we never knew about. They were there before, but they were in people's brains that we couldn't expect. On the other hand, I think in some cases we're increasing bias because these systems have this superficiality of neutrality, and also people sometimes think, oh, this is an interpretable model, there's nothing more I have to do. So I think, but I tend to be more optimistic than pessimistic in this area.
Great, and I think this is our last question. It's a little bit more on the in the worthy of a good Hollywood script. Do you see any state of or foreign jurisdiction to allow a sophisticated ML program, machine learning program, to take the bar and then represent actual clients on behalf of a firm, perhaps supervised by attorneys, so you at least have the theoretical possibility of human intervention or human vetting and final human decision making, sort of a joint lawyer team, robot and human?
Yeah, I don't think so in the near term. I think that would involve a breakthrough in AI technology that may or may not happen. And I tend to not to be speculative because I try and base upon where we are right now and where it looks like we're going in the next 5 years. And at least in the next 5 years, in my opinion, I don't see that happening, because that would involve these sort of breakthroughs in AI that allow it to deal with really abstract concepts in a reasonable manner. So even something like GPT-3, which is a piece of software from OpenAI, which produces pretty amazing results, kind of natural text results, is still more or less parroting stuff that's out there, and not really grappling with the underlying nuances that an attorney would have to understand to provide competent advice. So unless AI gets to the point where it's able to deal with the nuances and the abstractions, I don't think so. That being said, I think there are also a lot of easy cases in law. So I think increasingly AI systems will be able to help with really easy cases in the same way that translation systems like Google Translate can help you with rough and ready, easy translations that might be good enough for some, not where the stakes are lower.
Okay, I said it was going to be the last one, but one more came in that is pretty interesting and thought-provoking. I'll just dissect it a little bit and get the first part of it to make it a little bit shorter. But it says, you went over how we modeled the law computationally, but society and our laws are also modeled by the technologies we utilize. That said, do you think computable law is interfering, or I guess maybe, or will it influence with the role of our government officials and those who enforce or interpret the law? Sort of the feedback from the sort of computable law into humans and how we practice law.
This is a fabulous question, and I think this is really an underappreciated aspect of what's going on. So you're absolutely right. Like, where was the social discussion that said it was okay for courts to start using automated systems, right? Maybe that's okay in the end, and maybe we do agree, but we want that to come about through a deliberative process where we discuss this. And there's some evidence that judges don't want to decide against the machine's recommendations. So, and this is actually changing how judges operate. So just to give you a good example, say in the past, a judge was like, well, my intuition is that, there's only a 30% chance this person will reoffend, so I'll let them go. But it was just an intuition. Now a judge has all the reason in the world. If a system says, I think there's a 30% chance they might reoffend, they might say, well, might as well just lock them up anyway, because if that person commits a crime, somebody's going to say, hey, there was still a 3 out of 10 chance, and it wasn't like it was 1 out of 100, and you went with that, right? So in this way, we're seeing the system influence how judges operate. And I think that's fascinating and something we need to think about deliberately and study a little bit more. It's a great question.
Well, with that, I want to bring this to an end. I want to thank Harry for joining us for a outstanding talk and a thought-provoking Q&A. Both the attendants with great questions and Harry answering them. We promise to have you back in person. So thank you very much. Thanks everybody for joining. Before you leave, I wanted to just share